My name is Dr. Meredith Doig. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the president of the Rationalist Society, which is Australia's oldest free thought group. Now, wherever you're joining us from, the Rationalist Society acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land and sea and community. So tonight we have two for the price of one. There's a lot to get through, so I'll be very brief. Mike Dove is a demographer and a data scientist and is here tonight as convener of the Census 21 campaign, which was a joint initiative of a range of atheist and humanist and rationalist groups. Neil Francis is a social scientist and an independent researcher, and he's here tonight as a fellow of the Rationalist Society and a contributor to the Census 21 campaign, and also the author of what I would say is a landmark series of pieces of research, which is called Religiosity in Australia. It's on the Rationalist Society website, and I'd really encourage you to go and have a look at the documentation and the analysis that Neil has pulled together. Now, Mike will speak first, mainly about the Census 21 campaign and where it might go to from here. And then Neil will explain why the results of the census were actually quite misleading, even though they were very good from our point of view, but even so, they were quite misleading. So without further ado, Mike, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Meredith, and good evening, everybody. I am hoping that my sharing is on, and in which case I shall start off with the first slide. There we go. Okay, as Meredith has said, we're focusing here on the rise of no religion, and in the first of the first slide I'd like to show is in fact the agenda really for tonight, which is really identifying a series of themes rather than specifically going through each item. Firstly, what I intend to do is just to introduce or to remind people about the outcomes from the census and to point out what it tells us about no religion. And then I'll hand over to Neil, who will talk a bit about some question marks which might be attributed to that data and how that in fact flows through to the implications for a series of action items which we as a campaign are undertaking in relation to accuracy, policy, funding and voice. So those are really the things which we will talk about when we talk about what next, and then we'll round up with some time for some questions and discussion. So the first thing I'll say about the census is that this was a digital first census. About 80% of us completed the census online, which was clearly the highest ever. And the thing which I think is also worth saying about it is that it was conducted over a period of time, an extended response window of around about sort of 7 or 8 days leading up to census night. Traditionally, it was always done on the night. This had a period of lead up. And because that coincided also with a period of lockdown for most of Australia and the pandemic conditions, it meant that that probably had a positive impact on the participation rate, and the response rate was actually very high. It was 96.1% of all dwellings actually completed their census form. So I think that reflects a couple of the things which I'd indicated before. In terms of the not religious, in terms of the religion question, that also had a very high, much higher than expected response rate, where the not stated part of that question and the inadequately described, people who scribble things in the boxes, was only 7.3%, which is probably one of the lowest on record for that question, certainly over the last 30 years or so. So it's very low, particularly as it's an optional question. And Neil will talk more about some of those figures and the optional nature of the question a little later. In terms of the outcomes, it was well publicised, the religion question, in terms of the results, because it was one of the big stories, really, for both the media and also the ABS. And clearly what it showed was the continuing history of a long and steady increase in the green line, which is the line which represents no religion, to the point we're now almost 40% of respondents to the census indicated that they are not affiliated, and I choose that word carefully, as you will see, they're not affiliated with religion. And you'll see that the gap between that and the line above that, which represents Christianity, has narrowed to only about 5%. Again, looking historically, it has never been that narrow. If we look at this slide, I'm just looking at a couple of dimensions. There's many one could go into, but we'll just take a couple of them to give us a bit of a flavour of the results before we go into Neil's analysis. This is a chart which shows the sort of age, if you like, or the generational patterns as described by the advertising agencies' common terms, which they apply to us. In our cases, I think all three of us, myself, Neil and Meredith, are probably we belong into baby boomers. But clearly the no religion phenomenon, which is shown by the green lines, the green blocks, is a younger phenomenon on balance, with the baby boomers perhaps figuring much more strongly in terms of Christianity, and indeed the interwar, the older groups, much more strongly indeed, again, than younger population. So on the right-hand side, you can see the average for the whole country, and you can see generation by generation. So clearly the millennials, who we're told are going to be, the major driving force for thought, for consumption, and everything else over the next little while, are declaring their strength in allegiance with no religion. Looking at another dimension, which is looking at it state by state, we can see some interesting differences there. Again, the national figure is on the right of the figure of that chart on the right-hand side. The no religion lobby or response is dominated by Hobart, Tasmania really, the ACT and South Australia. So good on them for leading the charge. The other thing which I've included in this is a differentiation between the capital cities within each of those states and the country areas for those states. So unfortunately, we can see that, at least from a religious perspective, New South Wales comes out as being fairly conservative, and that's much more so in Sydney metropolitan area, perhaps reflecting the high proportion of religious migrants, which can be found in the Sydney metro area. In Melbourne, that's slightly less so, but it's still evident at the 37.3, just below the national average, were choosing no religion. If you looked at it within the city, you'd have big differences between the western suburbs and the eastern suburbs, of course, but overall, using Melbourne as a geography, it's just slightly below the average. The other thing which is clear is the strong performance of the country areas, which I find particularly interesting, and also perhaps Queensland generally being above average. It's not necessarily one of the things we might expect. So I found that personally a little bit surprising, but was interesting. So that's the sort of dimensions of the figures. And we might look to say, well, okay, well, where's that heading us? And this is a slide that I've borrowed with permission from my colleague Neil, and where he's done some analysis, and you might say it's speculation. Of course, we don't know what's going to be the driving forces between now and the next census, But if we to extrapolate to the next census and perhaps just slightly beyond, what you can see is that the no religion figure actually is expected to surpass the Christian figure probably next year, I would say, probably 2023. And in fact, you extend a bit beyond that, maybe to 2026 or 2027. And in fact, no religion will be larger than all religions. So any religion and all religions will be likely to be surpassed in around about 2027 by the no religion choice. So at this point, what I'm going to do is to hand over to Neil, who will tell us a bit about the some of the observations he makes about the census and give us some caution, I suppose. Be fair to say that as a campaign, we were moderately pleased to uplift from around about 30% in 2016 to getting just under 40% in 2021. We're pleased with that, but Neil is about to say why we shouldn't be too excited, and will give us some perspective on that. So I now hand over to Neil.
Well, thank you, Mike, for that introduction. What I'm going to talk about this evening is about black holes and rose-coloured glasses and a few other things besides. And that is talking about religion's real footprint and influence, and how, in particular, while the headline religion figures that we quote from the census are rather misleading and more than just a little bit. And so I propose to cover that very quickly in three parts. The first is how we measure the religion statistic. The second is what we make of that number and whether that's a reasonable thing or not. And the third is how particularly religionists at the more extreme end of the spectrum, the conservative, super conservative ones, can quite misrepresent what religious Australians actually think. So let's move into the first one, the measurement. And I'm going to cover the two things in the title here. The first is the black hole and the second is the rose-coloured glasses. Let's see what those things are about. When we look at the results from Census 2021, we can with some confidence say that 50.7% of females of Australians are female, and 6.2% say that they are 20 to 24-year-old. And as of the census, 46.5 of us were married.
Neil, were you going to share your screen?
Oh, I'm so sorry. This is really not. Yes, I thought I had shared my screen. So in Census 2021, we're not as confident about the religion figure of 53.5% as we are of the others. Because the first three are census questions. That is, everyone was compelled to answer them, and almost everybody did. And so we're quite confident of those figures. With religion, however, the answers were a sample, because this is the only question in the census that was, in fact, optional. People were not compelled to answer it. So I'll talk about black holes and rose-coloured glasses and religion's real footprint and influence, which I'm covering with measurement, interpretation and representation. And I am talking about measurement of the black hole and the rose-coloured glasses. Here's the black hole. Okay. We're confident about the first three example statistics. We're not confident about religion. And that is because the first three questions, everybody, or pretty well everybody, answered the question. The religion question is optional, so it's not a census, it's a sample. And that leads to a black hole. This 7.3% of Australians who did not answer the question. And what we normally do in social science is we allocate that black hole in the same proportion as people who answered the question properly. And I won't take you through the technical details, but this is what happens when we apply the adjustment, which in fact independent data shows is a reasonable thing to do in this circumstance. And so when we adjust for the black hole, the census data is actually 42% no religion and 58% religion. Don't worry about that 0.3%, that's just from rounding in the calculations. So that was the black hole. We've got the second part, which is the rose-coloured glasses, and this is a serious bias. And that is the census seriously overmeasures affiliation. It's an unintended bias, it's in the question, it's been there since 1901, long before, since we introduced really good scientific social research methods. And the question asks, what is the person's religion? It's a bit like a police officer interviewing a suspect saying, have you stopped beating your wife yet? And it introduces significant bias effects. And in social science, when we compare a biased question with an unbiased question, the smaller kind of biases we see in the responses are about 5 to 10%, and the larger kind of biases we see are 20 or 25%. Now, I looked into some international data for religious affiliation and found in the Netherlands there was an 18% bias from a presumptive question. In Australia, comparing two different pairs of data sets, I found 19 and 14%. And in the UK, I found 13%. So look, let's be modest. Let's proceed with the smallest figure, 13% bias introduced by the nature of the question. And let's see what effect that has on the numbers that we get out of the census. And this is what they look like. We start with the raw rate, and we adjust for the black hole. We remove the rose-coloured glasses, and we end up with what we think is the real rate. And for all religion, we started out with 54%. That gets bumped up to 58%. But when we remove the question bias, it drops to 45%. So all religion is not 54%, it's 45% when you ask the question properly. For Christians, we started out with 44% and we end up with 34%. That is quite different. And for the nuns, we start out with about 4 in 10 and we end up with well over half. That's an important difference.
Absolutely. Neil, just stop there, because when you showed me these data previously, I was just gobsmacked, because we're sort of patting ourselves on the back thinking that we've got up to nearly 40%, but the real number of people, if they had answered a properly designed question, the real number of people is already over half.
Correct. And so, look, Meredith, some people might say, well, Neil, that's a nice sort of mathematical bit of magic you did there. Is there any way we can check those figures? Is there any serious university or other government poll that asked the religion question in an unbiased way? And the answer is yes, there is. And it's called the Australian Survey of Social Attitudes. I'll call that ASA for short. It was run the year before the census in 2020. And these are the figures that were found when you ask a non-biased religion question. And so we're comparing the calculation from the census is 45 versus 46 for all religion. And if you look at the bottom row, we're comparing 55 with 54. That is well within experimental error. So we're quite comfortable and confident in saying that when you ask the question properly, these are the figures that one derives. You'll notice that there's a 5% difference between the two final results for Christians. And that's quite understandable, because the column that's labelled real rate is derived from the census. That is, every single household had to participate in the census. But the last column is actually a survey, about 2,000 respondents. And in a survey, it is much harder to attract and recruit and involve minority groups. So the ASA 2020 survey looks like it's slightly oversampled Christians and slightly undersampled non-Christian religionists. So that's fine. We're now comfortable and confident that the real figures are what we say here. And what we're doing is we're not splitting hairs and saying it's a fraction of a percent or something fairly insignificant. We're talking about really significant differences in the numbers. And just to remind ourselves, religion is not well over half, it's under half. Christians are not approaching half, they're a third. And no religion is not 4 in 10, it's well over half. Those are important differences. So let's move on to part 2, interpreting what all of this means. Will the real religion please stand up? It's important to recognise that when we measure religious affiliation, it's the most superficial measure of religion. And that's the method that the census and in every other country uses to measure religion. Headline figure. We can also measure religion by behaviour, by identity, by salience. There's personal importance and relevance of religion in a person's life, their beliefs and so on. And I'm going to very briefly touch on just two of those as examples. Here's the first one. This is behaviour. This is religionists' attendance at religious services. And down the left-hand side, you will see the major religious groups. And across the bottom, the legend. That light set of bars on the left are people who say they have a religion, but they never, ever turn up to religious services. Never. And those are very significant percentages, around 4 in 10 on average. They're very significant. And you'll see the next one, which is the light purple bars. Some of them are even bigger. And these are folks who turn up occasionally. On average, this means just once or twice a year. So these are folks who have a fairly light relationship with their religion. The dark purple on the very right-hand side are our devouts. They're the folks who turn up weekly or more often. And you can see that they're relatively small percentages of the population, except for the minor Protestant denominations. So that's behaviour. Let's have a quick look at identity. ABC Australia Talks, which many of you will remember from 2019, asked Australians a lot of questions about things to do with their personal life. One of these questions was to identify which attributes were important in defining one's identity. And that included things like political belief, nationality, gender, and language. And you'll see from this chart that religious beliefs is languishing very far down the bottom in last place. This is not to say that it is unimportant for all people, but it is a significantly less important point of identity for most Australians than ordinary things like political beliefs, nationality, gender, and language. So let's have a quick look, an overview at religion by the numbers, if you will. And that is, if you look at the top row, adjusted affiliation, that's our 57%. We've corrected for the black hole. That's the correct figure from the census. But it was asked for using rose-coloured glasses, so we subtract those and we get 44%. If we ask people whether they belong to a religion or not, just 38% of Australians say yes. And by the way, more than half of those say that they're not active, they're inactive. If you ask people whether they're religious, about a third say that they are. If you ask people if religion is important in their lives, fewer than a third, 29% say they are. Fewer than 25%, only 23% attend religious services twice or more a year. Only about 1 in 5 Australians is certain that God exists. About 1 in 6 Australians say that their religious belief is a spiritual belief. And although only 16% of Australians attend religious services monthly or more often, and right down the bottom, just 15% of Australians say they are active members of their religious congregation. So you can see the difference between 57% at the top, which is actually wrong, let's say 44% at the top, having taken away the rose-coloured glasses, and those who are active members of their religious community is quite remarkable. It's 15% versus 44%. So the headline figure really overestimates the relationship that Australians in general have with religion. So let's move on to part 3, which is the representation. And in this part, I'm again going to cover 3 very quick, short items. The first is abortion, and this is in relation to how conservative are Australian religionist attitudes about social matters. So I'll cover abortion. I will take a quick look at religious school discrimination against the Lgbti community and clerics as moral arbiters. But before I do that, I'm just going to very quickly introduce you to a model that I developed and I use to help explain these differences, and that is the ASI 6, the Australian Social Identity 6-segment model. It divides Australians into the socially progressive, the social moderates, and the social conservatives. And then within each of those, we divide them up into secular and religious, so that we end up with 6 segments from secular progressives to religious conservatives. And when we look at the abortion data, green means in favour of abortion, red means never available under any circumstances. And you'll see there that if you look at social progressives, social moderates and social conservatives, nobody said abortion should never be available. And even amongst religious conservatives, who are only 7% of the population, about 1 in 10 of those said abortion should never be available. And that means that we really hear simply from the loud ones who insist that abortion should be illegal. They not only don't represent religious Australians, they barely represent any religious conservatives. This is a massive difference from the United States.
Thank goodness for that.
And so I just want to share an example of that, and that is this fellow is Archbishop Mark Coleridge. He's the Catholic Archbishop of Brisbane, and he said that legalising abortions is not representative of the core values and beliefs of the greater community. Now, I would argue that it's pretty clear from the chart we just looked at that the Archbishop doesn't understand the core values and beliefs of the greater community. But I further argue that the Archbishop is out of touch with his own community, his own flock. And the reason I say that is here are the attitudes of Australian Catholics, his own flock. 61% of them say that abortion should be readily available. A further 29% of them say it should be available in special circumstances. And a bare 1% of them say that abortion should never be available. As a classic example...
Where are the American imports?
Well, a classic example of a disconnect between bishops and not only the wider community, but bishops and their own flocks. They're not representing the views of their own flocks. So let me move on to discrimination against LGBTI plus staff and students at religious schools. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly share with you some data you've never seen before. I think everyone will be fairly familiar with the reports in the news, polls that show about 2/3 of Australians say no, religious schools shouldn't be allowed to discriminate. But you might well ask, well, what do religious parents, what do parents of school-aged children think? Because people who are 80 are not sending their kids to school, and people who are 20 are not sending their kids to school. What about these folks who are parents? And so I have analysed, I've distilled out parents from the data, and this is parents of school children. These are their attitudes towards the morality of homosexuality. Green is in favour, red is out of favour. And down the left-hand side, we have religiosity. From the least, rejectors, down to the bottom, devouts, the most religious. And you'll see only amongst devouts is there a bare majority of those who are out of favour. These are parents of school children, folks. This is not the wider community. These are the people who are considering, or who might consider, sending their children to a religious school. Well, we might ask, well, almost all the decisions about which school a child goes to are mums. Are they different from dads? Let me show you the mums data. Watch the red on the right. These are mums of school kids. These are their attitudes. And again, barely a majority of opposition amongst devouts. And there is a significant contingent. 1 in 5 of devouts has a positive attitude, not a negative attitude. And only barely over half have a negative attitude. So when a religious leader says we must ban LGBTI people, staff or students from our schools because our parents demand it, this is demonstrably untrue. It is not true. It is demonstrably, massively false. And there's actually a big risk, a danger for religious schools, as we found from a great example from City Point Christian College in Queensland, really tried by contract to exclude gay students from this Christian college. And they had a massive backlash, and parents actually some parents withdrew their children from the school. So this really demonstrates the data in action. The third quick one is whether clerics should ultimately interpret laws, particularly about moral advice. And again, red is no, green is yes. The data is quite clear. The vast majority of Australians say no, clerics really oughtn't to be our final arbiters of interpreting laws. And you can see with the green bars on the right, hardly anybody thinks it's a good idea. So there's actually little appetite for religion in politics in Australia. And that's evidenced by Corey Bernardi, who was a Liberal MP. He quit the Liberals. He established the Australian Conservatives Party in 2017, based on quite conservative Christian values. Over 2 years, with various elections, they won no seats at all. They lost 2 seats, and it was deregistered in 2019. So this is a clear indication that there is no appetite for religious conservatism at the government level or at the representational level in Australia. And so these things, for example, are not justifiable. Christian prayers in Parliament or councils. Remember, we said 34% of Australians are Christian. Why are we having Christian prayers in Parliament or councils? Discrimination in publicly funded religious schools, not justifiable. Banning non-religious but otherwise qualified school chaplains from working in schools, no longer justifiable. So in conclusion, it's really important that we have a national conversation about these findings, the relationships that Australians actually have with religion. And this is critical to policy development and investment decisions. So in the 3 bits we've covered, it's important to use the correct unbiased religious affiliation rates, and that is no religion is already 55%. Australians with no religion are already in the majority, and we should be talking about that. The second is that the affiliation figure is actually quite superficial and it overestimates religiosity in Australia. Other figures give much lower real links with religiosity. And the third is that the religious are not nearly as socially conservative as clerics say on a range of social matters, and Australians don't want clerics claiming to represent them. So thank you. I'll hand back to the chair. Well, no, I'll hand back to Mike.
Okay, as Meredith pointed out at the beginning of this webinar, the Census 21, Not Religious, Mark No Religion, was a campaign which comprises the 6 free-thinking organisations, leading free-thinking organisations in Australia. And we had, some of you may be aware, some presence leading up to the census, census in 2021, which we would like to think was moderately influential at the very least in terms of encouraging people to consider the no religion option. In terms of going forward with campaign activity as a group, we are most certainly committed to continuing campaigning across the areas which I've indicated there. So accuracy, policy, funding, and voice and influence are all key themes that we want to make sure that the voices of the members of the 6 groups in the coalition are represented. And that's certainly our intent to do. There's some minor sort of details around ensuring that it makes sure it doesn't conflict with the particular objectives of any one of those partners. But on the whole, I think there is a fairly unified voice about the sort of things that we should certainly engage in. What I'd like to identify, what I'd like to focus on now is to look at 3 examples of the kind of activity we're engaged in right now, and to just share a little bit of information about those that hopefully will address some of the deficiencies in the census data that Neil has highlighted. So all is not lost. The census may not be the best measure of religion or religiosity, and indeed the no religion perspective. You know, we're certainly mindful of the need to try to improve that. A lot of that really comes through the accuracy theme, and that's where our primary focus is right now. So looking at accuracy, we are seeking to improve that data in a couple of ways, very specifically at the moment. This is the current question, which some of you, of course, most of you would have seen. You would have filled out the form. The paper form on the left, the online form, which most of us filled out on the right. And, you know, I've circled one obvious, you know, sort of challenge that you could make. You know, why is it that in a question which is asking about people's religion, we're including something like atheism, which almost by its very definition is not a religion. It certainly doesn't believe in a higher power. It seems totally inappropriate to mislead respondents to the census question by suggesting that is a question which meets the criteria, or any criteria really, for measuring whether someone is religious or not. So clearly that's going to be one of the areas that we will focus on. We're also going to be focusing on what Neil referred to as the presumptive bias, which is in the question, the inherent bias, which assumes before you start that someone does have a religion, and therefore it's not a question of, and it's quite odd that no religion is number one in the list. When they say, what is your person's religion? Well, the first one is no religion. Well, that's kind of a little bit odd, but there is a bias in the question, which is making that assumption that someone does have a religion. I believe there's also a contextual bias, which is created by the preceding questions, which encourage people who are responding to the census to think about their cultural background. Which country are they from? Are they citizens of Australia? Are their parents born here or overseas? What is their ancestry? All of those things, I think, condition a respondent to think in terms of their cultural background and their cultural religion, if you like. So, surprise, surprise, a very large number of people, in my mind, would be choosing a religion which coincides with the one that they were brought up with. And I think that, that's something that we must continue, I think, to challenge. And all of that is coming about from those two forms of bias, which are in the question as it currently stands. It's maybe unfortunate, but the reality is that the census is used as the primary evidence base for the allocation of billions of dollars of taxpayer resources in areas such as education, healthcare, social services, aged care, and indeed in justification for share of voice in the media. And it's, that is the gold standard. People use that as their evidence. So we have to work hard to put pressure on the ABS to make sure that these figures are as accurate as possible and that they do reflect the reality so that we do end up with fair allocation of resources. The census question itself comes under review in early 2023, and you can be assured that as a campaign, we'll certainly be making submissions and representations in that process. And we shouldn't lose complete hope, because although there are some other countries, such as New Zealand in 2018, England and Wales 2021, Canada in 2021 as well, where it's essentially the same form of question. The way they design the question, the boxes they provide are slightly different, but essentially it's the same question. What is your religion? What is the person's religion? But there is hope, I believe. And in Ireland, this year's census in Ireland in March, they actually did include the suffix, if any, which is something that I know Neil has been pushing for some time, and several others have as well in the Census Coalition. So Ireland has actually got to that point. Scotland is asking a slightly different question, but again, it's what religion, religious domination, or body do you belong to, which again is slightly different and goes one step further than just saying what is your religion. Northern Ireland goes even further. What religious denomination or body do you belong to? And then it differentiates. So it can see what religion were you brought up in. Now in Northern Ireland, that has particular meaning and resonates in a particular way. But you can see that what the question is doing is beginning to differentiate between those different levels of commitment that Neil was referring to in his presentation. So there is hope, is the message of that slide. The second area where we're focusing on and trying to improve the accuracy is in the classification itself. The classification is an important dimension of accuracy because the results, as they are entered, are coded to the classification. So it is important that the classification itself is fit for the purpose of guiding resource allocation, which is why the data is collected in the first place. The current classification at the most detailed level, which I'm not displaying here, actually comprises 150 detailed categories. They will include things that are listed above there, such as humanism and rationalism, etc. But those 150 religions, if you like, as they are part of the Australian standard classification of religious groups, is very detailed. And I'll point out, the chart indicates this, Buddhism is reduced to one category. Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, likewise. They're all represented by one single category at the most detailed level, and indeed at this level of reporting, which I've indicated for the broad groups. This is despite there being significant variations in subgroups within each of those religions. Christianity, on the other hand, is represented by 97 denominations. And if ever there was some indication of, if you like, religious bias or privilege or Christian bias, Christian privilege, it would have to be in that, particularly as many of those, 60% of the categories, most of those being Christian, would have less than 5,000 respondents. Something like 35 or 40% have less than 500 respondents. So in terms of resource allocation, they're really fairly meaningless. They're not really going to inform people to allocate resources in a wise and fair way. Could also argue that maybe I was reading something last week that apparently there's yet another Christian spin-off called the Diocese of the Southern Cross, which has emerged in Brisbane, splitting off from the Anglican Church in Queensland due to the single issue of same-sex marriage. So just on that single issue, they've suddenly split off and created another dimension. So we can see how easy it is to create splits within religion, yet on just one issue. And so, as I said, many of these will contain very insignificant numbers. Broad group 7, which is what I've displayed on the screen, you can see how they sum up, and you can see that no religion, which is one of these large groups on the right-hand side, is in fact, that's the group called secular beliefs and other spiritual beliefs and no religious affiliation, as the ABS chooses to call it. So, but no religion, which is the one which is second on the list there, comprises about 99%, 98.8% of all respondents within that group actually have chosen no religion. And they are lumping together this sort of, grab bag, if you like, of other faiths, spiritual beliefs and secular beliefs into that same category. But it's not really doing, inevitably, the shorthand for this group, rather than using that long, cumbersome label, which puts no religious affiliation, which again is the 99% of the group, at the end of the label, rather than at the beginning. So these are the kinds of sloppiness that I see in the classification, which I think is symptomatic of the accuracy issues which need to be addressed. So suffice to say that we are going to be making a submission to the ASCRG, as it's called, the Australian Standard for the Classification of Religious Groups. And I'm led to believe that that process will start on Monday, and I'm sure that it will have significant input from religious groups, and it will certainly have some input from us.
We've got about 10 minutes left.
Okay, I shall speed along. And of course, in 2026, we'll also be addressing the accuracy of that question there. The third and final example, which I would draw attention to of some work we're doing, is really, we know that federal and some state departments still recite a Christian prayer as the beginning of business, and we currently have, and in the past, and will continue to make representations about that. Many local governments also perpetuate this irrelevant practice in a secular society, and what I've done here is to collate some results for Victoria. Apologies for non-Victorians tuning in. I live in Victoria, so hence my bias in prioritising that. And I also noticed that National Secular Lobby also has a database on its website of jurisdictions that do recite prayers. What I've done here is to record the no religion percentages for those Victorian LGAs that currently recite a prayer. And I've actually emphasized Nillumbik because that's the one I live in. And last night I attended the Nillumbik Shire Council meeting and asked a couple of questions about why it is and how it is that they continue to justify to say a prayer. And of course, I got the fairly standard, bland, dismissive answer, but I've no doubt that the message was received and registered. And I suspect that that will be taken on board in when they come to review this in the future. It also illustrates the point that it's actually easy for individuals to take actions at their local area to try to get some influence, which can alert people to the fact that No Religion is a serious lobby group. On the next slide, I've included my email address and the URL for the NSL for you to follow through if you wanted to find out more information about that. And I'd be happy to assist people if they wanted to do so. So that's it really in terms of the kind of 3 areas of activity that we're currently engaged in, 2 in accuracy, the accuracy of the data, 1 in relation to voice. And what I'd now like to do is to pass back to Meredith to manage the questions, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mike. There's an amazing amount of material that both Neil and Mike have put together. And I want on your behalf, on everybody's behalf, to just ask a few questions. These have been sent in previously. So, Mike, if I can start with you, Julia Mizuno has sent in a question and I'll read it out. She says that she understands that the ABS has cited consistency as the reason for not changing the religion question in the census. So what's a solid counter argument? So consistency over time is what I understand. So what's the counter argument to this consistency principle?
I think it'd be fair to say that consistency is important, but otherwise we wouldn't do that time series analysis. So, but it's a question of balancing the two. Do we want consistency, or do we want to improve the quality of the question so it does actually reflect accurate data? And indeed, does it try to resolve things like that muddled broad group 7, which includes a stack of groups which are secular, spiritual, and also non-religious. We want that to be rationalised, and so things must change. And I think the good news is from the example I've given about Ireland and Scotland, Northern Ireland, is that there is some indication of change. It must be fair to say that international census organisations do get together a fair bit online, I presume, and they do tend to arrive at fairly common positions. Questions will always be presented slightly differently, but there's a lot of commonality between the census groups that I highlighted through the questions I showed. And I'm encouraged by the fact that Ireland this year and Scotland and Northern Ireland last year have taken some steps to move away from the bland question that we have been currently presented with.
And I think we'll all be working hard to make sure that we not only follow Ireland, but outstrip them, take a leadership position. Question from Max Wallace of the New South Wales Secular Association, who unfortunately can't be here with us. I think Max and Meg are not too well. And this probably I'm going to hand to you, Neil. Question is this. The New South Wales Secular Association sponsored research in 2015 that found that a proportion of voters said religion influences their vote at election, a proportion. Would the presenters agree that this does establish that there is a religious vote in Australia? Neil.
Well, what a great question. And given that it was on notice, I had the opportunity to actually go get the data and find out what that proportion was. Where's my control? I don't know where the control button's gone. I was going to show you the chart.
Don't worry. I think it was about 14% in total.
It is 14%. So 5% say yes, religion very much influences my vote in elections, and 9% say, well, religion somewhat influences my vote at elections, and the rest of Australians say no, not at all, or not applicable because I'm not religious. And so just to reflect back to the question, would we agree that there is a religious dimension in voting? Well, yes, there is, but it is pretty small. And so this is a 14% effect. And we can kind of relate that, if you will, back to a chart I showed earlier, which is that 15% of Australians say that they are active members of their religious community, their religious congregation. So we can see a connection there. It's a slight amount, but what this does is it really overrates the claim that it is religion itself that is affecting the vote in elections. And that is, so for example, after the 2019 election, Labor investigated why it lost an election it was expected to win. And one of the conclusions it drew was that it thought that it was losing somewhat on the religious vote. And I can't share with you because I don't know what's happened to Zoom. It's just disappeared. But I do have a chart. It's actually coming up. Bit of a spoiler alert, folks. It is coming up in the next edition of Religiosity in Australia. And that is when we separate out whether people are socially conservative, moderate or progressive, when we separate out whether they're religious or not within each group, it turns out that within each group, the religious are more conservative across a whole range of policy areas. Let me just describe a handful: economic management, government debt, superannuation, taxation, immigration, refugees and asylum seekers, education, health and Medicare, global warming, environment, practically everything. So when we see what we think is a religious effect, it's actually a social effect. It's not a faith-based effect. So that's how I would say, yes, we would recognise that there is a religious component, but when you look at Cory Bernardi's failures, and we look at the failure of the Morrison government to get religious privileges over the line, some of its own members defected to the other side, it's not that significant. In fact, there's more opposition to religious privilege than there is.
I think the takeaway number, Neil, that everybody here could remember is that it's around 14 or 15% of Australian voters, or Australians, who are religiously devout, and therefore their religion is more likely to influence their vote.
Yeah,
that vote is likely to be.
Devouts are about 12%. So we're seeing in New South Wales Secular Association's research, 5% say, yes, religion very much influences my vote, but 9% say somewhat. You know, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. Can I just draw attention of everybody to the chat box where Max Burke has said in relation to the ABS, the counter argument to the ABS, he says the ABS always and has done for decades used the consistency argument to resist any change. And I think the riposte, the reply must be, but it's not our census, but is not our census aimed at finding out what makes our society tick, not just preserving something that's based on the early 1900s when the census was established. Good point. Thank you, Max. Let's get on to other questions that were sent in. Here's one from Lauren Sturb. And Mike, I'm going to throw this one to you. For many people, a barrier to fully identifying with no religion is the perception that all opportunities to connect with a community are lost. How can we build a new narrative around not needing religion to build community connections and safety nets and identity?
Thank you. I totally agree with the drift of the question. I think it is a challenge that I think we've yet to develop, if you like, an action plan towards. And that I think is what we need to do. But we need to work out what attractive forums and pathways there are for people to connect. I mean, clearly there are many informal, non-religious ones that exist at the moment. You know, men's sheds, book clubs, U3A, all sorts of sports and cultural organisations, and sport. And I think that's really encouraging, where religion plays no role at all. And it may just be that, you know, that they simply replace the communities that exist. But I personally just wonder, you know, there's these fabulous kind of meeting places scattered all over the country, all over our cities, which are called churches. And yet it would be wonderful if they were to serve a purpose that had nothing to do with the supernatural. And it really was about bringing people together. So I totally agree with the drift of the question. I'm not sure how we quite yet address the challenges, meet that challenge in the form of an action plan.
Well,
I look forward to being part of it.
One way of looking at it is that the Australian religion is sport, and indeed there are, I think, participation in sports and community sports is the highest voluntary participation in Australia. Neil, I'm looking to you. I think that's the right, but let's move on anyway. Here's a question from John Barrell, who says, with some of the advancements that are being made to issues and laws being changed, such as VAD, what is to stop a change of government reversing these positions? So Neil, would you like to make a comment on that?
Yeah, look, I've already shared, you saw the charts for abortion, for example. This is seriously different from the United States in that hardly anybody thinks it's a good idea to entirely ban abortion. And I think I've just found the share button. So let me share this screen. Is that showing you a chart?
It is.
Lovely. Okay, so once again, greens on the left are approved. This is attitudes towards voluntary assisted dying, which the religious hierarchy tell us we shouldn't have. So attitudes towards VAD, green on the left approve, red on the right disapprove, and you can see quite clearly that hardly anybody disagrees. Even amongst religious conservatives, who those red folks tell you all disagree, less than half agree. Only 40% of religious conservatives disapprove of voluntary assisted dying. So it's very clear that we might invoke memories of, for those of us who used to watch Yes Minister with Sir Humphrey, if someone, an MP, were to propose a backward step against Australian opinion, which is seriously progressing towards social progressivism, the response from the Chief of Staff would be, that's courageous, Minister.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Somebody's just pointed out that Tony Crins had a very good question, so I'm just going to insert that. By the way, it's now past 8:30, and I'm normally pretty good at trying to wrap this up after 1 hour. With everybody's indulgence, I'm just going to extend for about 5 or 6 minutes more. We've only got a few more questions to go. If you need to go, please feel free to do so. For those of you who do have the ability to stay on just for about 5 or 6 minutes more, I invite you to do so. Tony Crins had this question, and it was to Neil. Neil, are you aware of the connection between religion and conspiracy theorists?
Look, there is a connection, and it's important to note that it actually is not a 100% overlap. Some people might think that it's a complete overlap of two sets. It isn't. There are people who are not religious who subscribe to conspiracy theories. There are people who are religious and subscribe to conspiracy theories, but there are common traits to those who subscribe to religion and conspiracy theories, which indicates it is true that there is a higher incidence, but that is not to say if you're religious, you subscribe to conspiracy theories. And just a couple of those characteristics are that people who subscribe to conspiracy theories like to think that they're special people. They know secret stuff that nobody else understands. And these are also people who have overactive theories of mind, and so they start projecting all sorts of beliefs and intentions and so forth on others that they simply don't have.
For those of you who subscribe to RSA Daily, I've included a number of articles over the last few months about the understanding. There's a lot of research going on at the moment to understand what it is that attracts people to become conspiracy thinkers. So I think it's a recognized phenomenon. In America, it's much more consistent with white Christian nationalism, but as Neil says, not 100% overlap.
Yeah,
it's a very strange
phenomenon that's really important, and that is conspiracy theorists are vastly more likely to see patterns in random data.
Yes.
So you and I would look at something and say, nothing to see here.
Yes.
And conspiracy theorists just join a whole bunch of random dots and say, here's the picture.
Yes, indeed. All right. A few more questions before we wrap up. And, here's one from Ross Corkery, which is, how does Australia compare, and this is for you, Neil, how does Australia compare with the USA, noting that Texas has just reformed the law to force schools to display "In God We Trust" signs? And I suppose what he's specifically referring to is religiosity. How does Australians' religiosity compared with Americans' religiosity?
Well, look, there's quite a difference. I actually talk specifically to trust because that is the nature of the question. It's printed on currency in the US. It's the national motto. It has been since the 1950s. But Australia is really different. We've seen from the data I've shown earlier this evening that Australians are far less religious, have a softer relationship with religion, less conservative. But in the matter of trust, let me show you two things. And if I can find my button, I will share that. Are you seeing a slide? Trust in people?
Yeah. Yes.
Lovely. Okay, so when we talk about classes of people, we have doctors and nurses, scientists, law enforcement, judges, and so on. You'll see that the one I've highlighted is religious leaders. And whereas religious leaders say we are the people that you should trust, we are moral leaders, you should take our advice, this is what Australians actually think about religious leaders. So it's significantly below judges, military personnel, journalists, and even union leaders, and really only above corporate executives, politicians, and celebrities who score pretty low. So that's trust in people. Let's talk about trust in institutions, so sticking to this trust theme. This chart looks at 25 different kinds of institutions, from the armed forces and police at the top to television and political parties at the bottom. And what I've done is I've compared the attitudes of people who are low or medium in religiosity, which is 88% of Australians, versus those who are high in religiosity, which is just the top 12 of the most religious. And you'll see that they agree mostly on most of, in terms of trust, on most of those institutions. The absolute standout is the churches. If you follow the purple bar for the church, purple dot for the churches up to the top, it's actually number 3 amongst the high religiosity people. They trust armed forces, they trust police, and they trust the churches next. For everybody else, it's way down, almost at the bottom of the list. This is a massive divide. And here we're talking about the trust that 88% of Australians hold in the churches. It's massively different from the US. And so we are extremely unlikely to follow the US path, if you will.
Thank goodness for that. Look, I'm very concerned about the timing here, so I'm going to wrap it up after just one more question, which I think is a really good one. And it's from Joanna Brown. And Mike, I'm going to hand this one to you. She says, many non-believing Australians don't see the point in arguing for a change to secularism in government, because they feel that it has no effect on their lives or their loved ones, and they don't care either way. So how can we convince those people why it's important to argue for a secular government without being militant about it?
Okay, was my first reaction to that. And I thought, well, I think there's a real marketing dimension to this. I think it's a really, really good point. And I think it's about, there is a risk that we can be in our ivory towers, in our conceptualizing and forming of principles which need to change within our structures and our politicians, etc. But I do think that we do need to focus on the what's in it for me dimension a little bit, about why secularism is good for us as individuals and for us as families and for us as smaller communities. There is that distance, a disconnect, I think, almost between the institutions of society and our families. And I think that, yes, we have to learn something about how we communicate, the messages we communicate. One thing I did notice, and this is, I'm not a real big champion of the ABS, I might seem like it sometimes, but the ABS, when they were promoting the 21 census and encouraging people to participate, they developed a whole series of stories around what the census data is used for. And the vast majority of that was focusing on individuals and the people and the families and the communities who benefit from the census data and that is presented. And I think that maybe there's a lesson to be learned from, you know, the very powerful marketing departments of the likes of ABS in how we project our message to make it as meaningful as possible to people within their families at family level. As for militancy, there is so much wrong and there are so many negative consequences of the current state in terms of the influence of religiosity and funding, etc. It's very hard for us at times to not be militant. I don't think I'm not proposing violence, but I do think we need to be assertive and we need to be strong in our positioning as to, depending on who we're relating to, in asserting our position. Because if we're not, the religious organisations most certainly will be.
Indeed. Wise words to wrap up with. Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you, Neil. I think you'll all agree that there was a lot in this webinar. We have recorded it, so it will be available to you and to others if you want to pass it on to other people. But thank you to our terrific two presenters. Thank you, everybody, for staying the course with us. I apologise that it's a bit over time, but I think it was worthwhile to just go through to the end there. As usual, we'll have another webinar next month, and I look forward to seeing as many of you at the next one as possible. Until then, thank you very much, and good night, everybody.